My name is Nora Calloway. I am 29 years old. And the night my mother stood in front of 47 wedding guests and announced that I was the reason our family had trust issues, I was sitting at table 7 in a pale yellow dress I had driven 3 hours to wear, with a glass of sparkling water I had not touched, and a smile I had been practicing since childhood. She did not whisper it. She did not pull me aside. She tapped the microphone during the rehearsal dinner toast, waited for the room to settle the way people do when they enjoy an audience, and said, and I am quoting from memory because some sentences embed themselves permanently, I want to thank everyone who actually showed up for Danielle, not just when it's convenient. Some people in this family only appear when there's something in it for them. But tonight, the right people are here. She looked directly at me when she said some people. Then she smiled at my stepfather, clinked his glass, and let the applause absorb whatever answer I might have had. My sister, the bride, laughed the way she always did when our mother drew blood at a social function. A little too high-pitched, a little too fast, followed by a redirect. Mom, okay. And then the conversation moved on, the way it always moved on, because moving on was something this family had elevated to an art form. I did not cry. I did not stand up and defend myself. I picked up my glass, took a long, slow sip, and spent the next 3 seconds memorizing the exact expression on my stepfather's face. Satisfied. That was the word. He looked like a man who had watched something he ordered arrive exactly as described. What my mother did not know, what none of them knew, was that I had been preparing for a moment like this for 2 years, not because I had planned it, but because when people treat you like a problem they've already solved, they stop paying attention to what you're actually doing. I need to back up. My grandfather built a small regional moving and storage company out of a single truck and a borrowed garage in Knoxville, Tennessee, starting in 1978. By the time he retired, he had 6 trucks, 2 warehouse facilities, and a reputation solid enough that 2 national chains had tried to buy him out. He refused both times. He said he didn't build something with his name on it to watch someone else sand it off. His name was Harold Gaines. He was the most methodical person I ever met, and the only adult in my early life who treated a question I asked as though it deserved a real answer. When I was 12, he sat me at his kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and showed me how a balance sheet worked. When I was 15, he let me help reconcile the quarterly vendor accounts. When I was 17, and everyone else in my family was orbiting my sister's college acceptances and my stepfather's latest scheme to franchise something, my grandfather pulled me aside at Christmas and said, quietly, "You understand numbers the way I do. Don't let anyone talk you out of that." I did not let anyone talk me out of it. By 29, I worked remotely as a forensic accountant for a firm based in Nashville, contracted primarily to legal teams and insurance carriers who needed someone to untangle financial records that had been either mismanaged, manipulated, or both. I was good at it in the way that people who were trained to look for the thing that doesn't fit tend to be good at it. I noticed discrepancies. I noticed patterns. I noticed when numbers told a story that the person presenting them did not intend to tell. I kept my work quiet at family events, because explaining forensic accounting to my stepfather was like explaining tide patterns to someone who had never been to the ocean. He would nod, rephrase whatever I said into something simpler and slightly wrong, and then repeat that wrong version to other people with full confidence. It was easier to say I did finance stuff and let him fill in whatever version of that he preferred. My mother had been with my stepfather for 14 years. He was not cruel in any obvious way. He was charming at parties and generous with compliments that cost him nothing, and very strategic about money in ways that mostly benefited himself. He had 2 grown sons from a previous marriage, who were present at every family milestone and vocal about everything, and never asked me a single genuine question about my life in any of the years I had known them. My sister Danielle was 3 years younger than me, and had always been the family's center of gravity. Not because she was unkind, she wasn't, but because she was easy in the way some people are just naturally easy, warm, and uncomplicated. And our mother had organized her emotional world around Danielle the way certain people organize their houses around one good piece of furniture. Everything else was arranged in relation to it. I had never resented Danielle for this. I had, at various points, been genuinely glad one of us fit without friction. The problem was not my sister. The problem was that for the past 2 years, my stepfather had been using my grandfather's company to solve problems that were not my grandfather's to solve. My grandfather died 22 months before the rehearsal dinner. He left the company, both warehouse properties, and a trust containing his liquid assets to be divided between his 2 grandchildren, which meant me and Danielle. He named me executor of the estate and trustee of the business operations, specifically because of the finance background, and specifically because, and this was in the document in his own words, Nora has always understood what the numbers are actually saying. My stepfather had been on the company's advisory board in an unofficial capacity for 3 years, before my grandfather died. Unofficially meant he attended quarterly meetings, contributed opinions nobody had asked for, and occasionally signed documents on behalf of family continuity when my grandfather was dealing with a health issue and had not gotten around to formalizing who should and shouldn't be signing things. After the estate cleared probate, I discovered that during the 14 months between my grandfather's first major health event and his death, my stepfather had authorized 4 vendor contract amendments, redirected 2 insurance reimbursement deposits, totaling $63,000 into an account I did not immediately recognize, and verbally approved a lease extension on one of the warehouse facilities at below market rate to a logistics company that, once I pulled the LLC registration, listed my stepfather's oldest son as a registered agent. I am a forensic accountant. I know exactly what that kind of paperwork looks like when someone builds it carefully versus when someone builds it assuming no one is watching. I did not confront anyone. I did not send an angry email. I hired an estate attorney named Patricia Morrow, who had an office downtown, a reputation for precision, and the energy of someone who had heard every version of this story before, and still found the facts more interesting than the drama. I spent 4 months with her, organizing documents, pulling records, tracing the LLC, building a timeline. I also said nothing to my mother. I said nothing to my sister. I went to Thanksgiving and ate turkey and listened to my stepfather explain cryptocurrency to the room and smiled at appropriate moments and drove home and added to the folder on my encrypted drive that I had labeled simply, Grandfather's Work. The rehearsal dinner was on a Friday in April. The public humiliation was at 7:43 in the evening. I know the time because I checked my phone immediately after, the way you instinctively reach for something solid when the floor shifts. I went home to my hotel room that night and sat on the edge of the bed and thought for a long time about what my grandfather had told me once when I asked him why he never yelled at people who made mistakes. He said yelling was for people who didn't trust their evidence. I trusted my evidence. The wedding was Saturday afternoon in a botanical garden outside Knoxville. White chairs on a gravel path. A string quartet, my sister glowing in a way that was entirely genuine. I was a bridesmaid. I walked down the aisle in a sage green dress. I held her bouquet during the vows. I was present for every part of the day the way I always showed up for things that mattered, completely, without fanfare. At the reception, my stepfather gave a toast that included 3 sentences about how he had basically saved the family business after my grandfather passed. He said it smoothly, almost as a parenthetical, the way people insert rewrites of history when they believe the original author isn't present to object. My mother beamed. His sons applauded. My aunt, who had known my grandfather for 50 years and understood exactly what was being said, looked at her plate. I ate my salmon. I danced with my sister. I left at 10 o'clock. Monday morning I called Patricia and told her I was ready to move forward. What followed was not fast or dramatic. It was documentation. It was letters. It was a formal notice to my stepfather that he was no longer authorized to represent the estate, the trust, or the company in any capacity, and that all prior communications conducted under unauthorized representation would be subject to review. It was a separate notice to the logistics company that their below-market lease would not be renewed and that the current lease rate would be corrected to market value effective immediately, with a demand for back payment of the Pointis Fistioctine difference. It was a referral to a forensic auditor Patricia brought in to formally document the $63,000, which we eventually traced to an account held by a shell company. My stepfather had opened under a name, very close to the name of my grandfather's company, Close enough to pass a quick glance, different enough to be legally distinct. I was not the one who told my mother. Patricia's office sent formal correspondence, which is what happens when an estate trustee exercises authority over assets that have been mismanaged by an unauthorized party. My mother called me on a Wednesday afternoon 3 weeks after the wedding, and she was not crying. She was cold in the way she got when she felt embarrassed and needed someone to blame for the embarrassment. "I need you to explain what you've done," she said. "I'm enforcing grandfather's estate," I said. "You're attacking this family. I'm protecting grandfather's assets from someone who redirected them without authorization." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was trying to help. He was trying to keep the business running after Dad died." I had heard this version already. My stepfather had told it first to my mother and then, I later learned, to my sister and both of his sons, the version where he stepped in during a difficult time and held things together, and I, ungrateful and paranoid and probably jealous, was now weaponizing legal documents against a man who had only ever tried to help our family. It was a good version. It had enough emotional truth wrapped around the factual untruth that people who wanted to believe it could. He deposited $63,000 of company funds into an account he controlled, I said. Patricia has the transfer records, the account documentation, and the LLC filings. If he was helping, the records would show that. "You have no idea what the pressure was like after Dad died," she said. "You were doing your finance job from your apartment in Nashville. He was here." I thought about my grandfather's kitchen table, the yellow legal pad, the way he had looked at me like someone who was genuinely interested in what I would become. "I was here too," I said. "I was here every weekend the last 6 months of his life. I was the one who reviewed the vendor contracts with him when he was too tired to sit upright, and we had to put the laptop on the hospital tray table. I know what the original contract said, and I know what was changed after." She hung up. The calls started the next morning. My stepfather first, not angry, careful, using the voice he reserved for negotiations, the voice that suggested he was being remarkably patient with an unreasonable situation. He wanted to talk. He wanted to explain. He used the phrase family resolution 4 times in a 4-minute voicemail. His older son called 40 minutes later and was significantly less patient. He said I was destroying his father's reputation over a bookkeeping misunderstanding, and that any reasonable person would see that what he'd found was actually evidence of my incompetence as a trustee, not his father's wrongdoing. He said several other things after that which I saved and forwarded directly to Patricia. My sister called that evening. She did not take sides, which I understood. She was 3 weeks out of her wedding, and still in the emotional blur of it, and the last thing she wanted was to watch the 2 people who had shaped her childhood become positions in a legal dispute. She asked me if there was any way to handle this quietly. "It is being handled quietly," I said. "Patricia is not involving media. I am not posting anything. I am not calling people. The only people who know anything are the people the formal notices were sent to. Mom is devastated. Mom is embarrassed," I said, not unkindly. "Those aren't the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. "Nora, he's been in our lives for 14 years. "I know. Does that count for nothing?" I sat with that for a second. Not because it was a hard question, but because I wanted to answer it honestly. "It counts," I said. "It counts for why I took 2 years to build the documentation before I did anything. It counts for why I'm doing this through an attorney, and not a public accusation. But 14 years of presence doesn't authorize someone to redirect estate assets. Those are 2 separate things." She didn't have a response to that. Not a counterargument, just silence. The kind that means someone is trying to hold 2 incompatible things at once. My mother's second call came on a Saturday, 10 days after the first. This time, she was not cold. She was the other version, the one I had grown up most familiar with. The voice that started with hurt and moved steadily toward guilt, each sentence a step on a staircase she had been building for decades. She said my grandfather would be ashamed of how I was handling this. I had expected that one. I had thought about it, actually, alone in my apartment on a Tuesday night with a cup of tea going cold on the counter, looking at the framed photo I kept of him on my bookshelf, the one where he was standing in front of the first warehouse in 1984. squinting into the sun with his hands in his pockets. And I had concluded, with some confidence, that a man who spent 40 years building something specifically so it wouldn't be dismantled would not be ashamed of the person trying to prevent it from being dismantled. He gave me the authority, I said. He wrote it down. He chose his words carefully. I'm using that authority the way he intended. He wanted family to work together. He wanted the business protected. He told me that in writing. You are so much like him, she said. And the way she said it made clear she did not mean it as a compliment. I know, I said. The formal legal process moved on its own timeline after that. The restitution demand for the $63,000 was contested, then negotiated, then settled. The logistics company vacated the warehouse facility after declining to sign the corrected lease. My stepfather resigned from any remaining informal company role in exchange for the estate not pursuing the matter through litigation, which Patricia recommended as the practical resolution, even though the evidentiary record would have supported further action. My stepfather did not apologize. My mother did not apologize. What I received instead, about 6 weeks after the settlement was finalized, was an invitation to Sunday dinner, extended by my sister on behalf of everyone, framed as a chance to move forward. I went because Danielle asked me, and because there are things you do for the people you love, even when the occasion surrounding those things is primarily designed to make someone else comfortable. The dinner was at my mother's house, a house I had grown up in, and that still smelled like the same dryer sheets she had been buying since 1997. My stepfather sat at the head of the table. His sons were not there, which I noted. My mother had made her pot roast, which was the meal she made when she wanted a room to feel warm before something difficult happened. Nobody mentioned the estate. Nobody mentioned the settlement. My stepfather talked about a fishing trip he was planning. My mother talked about a renovation she was considering for the guest bathroom. My sister talked about a couch she and her husband were trying to decide between. I ate my pot roast and participated and waited. After dinner, while my sister and her husband were helping clear the table, my mother sat down next to me on the back porch. It was a warm evening, the kind of Tennessee spring where the air is soft enough to make difficult conversations feel like they might be survivable. She said, I don't want this to be where we end up. I looked at the backyard. The oak tree my grandfather had planted when my mother was a child was still there, now enormous. Ibernatia, Ibel had, and enormous branches stretching wide enough to shade the entire yard. I don't either, I said. He made a mistake, she said. Not he was wrong, not he hurt you. Just the neutral construction, the passive architecture of someone trying to acknowledge a fact without fully landing on it. Multiple mistakes, I said, over a sustained period of time. She closed her eyes briefly. Nora, I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm being accurate. There's a difference. She looked at her hands. She had her father's hands. I had noticed that before. Wide and practical, hands that looked like they knew how to fix things. He was scared after Dad died, she said. The business, the money, everything was suddenly uncertain, and he panicked. I understand that, I said. I was also scared. And I drove up here every other weekend and sat with a lawyer and did the work. The difference is what we each chose to do with that fear. She was quiet for a long time. The oak tree moved slightly in a breeze coming from the south. Your grandfather used to say you were the most like him, she said finally. I thought he meant stubborn. Maybe he meant thorough, I said. Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile. Something older than a smile. More complicated. The expression people get when they recognize something they've been looking at incorrectly for a long time. Maybe, she said. We sat together until the first fireflies started in the far end of the yard. We did not resolve everything. I did not expect to. The structure of what she had told herself about her husband, about that period of time, about my role in what had happened, that would take longer than one conversation to reorganize. I understood that. I was a forensic accountant. I knew that a record built over years did not correct itself in an evening. But she had sat down next to me. She had said she didn't want this to be where we ended up. She had used the word mistake. That was a place to start. The company operates now under independent management oversight. A professional operations director I hired on Patricia's recommendation, a woman named Gwen, who had run regional logistics for 15 years and had no interest in family politics and an excellent eye for the kind of vendor relationship that looks convenient until you examine it closely. Quarterly reviews go to me as trustee. The financial statements are audited annually by an outside firm. My grandfather's name is still on both warehouse buildings. I made sure of that before anything else was decided. I do not have a triumphant resolution to offer you. My stepfather and I do not have Sunday dinners. His sons and I do not speak. My mother and I are in a period that I would describe as careful, the kind of relationship that is being rebuilt with attention to load-bearing structures, tested before weight is added. It is not what I wanted the family to be. It is what the family actually is, which is the only honest place to build from. What I have is my grandfather's company, running properly. What I have is both warehouse buildings, maintained. What I have is $63,000 returned to the estate, which I eventually used partially to fund a scholarship in my grandfather's name at the vocational school, where he took his first mechanics course in 1973. The rest went into a capital reserve for the company the way he would have wanted. What I also have is the thing I had on the night of the rehearsal dinner, in the moment after my mother made me a public footnote in a toast about my sister's wedding. I had the knowledge that I was already 3 months into a process that would ultimately protect everything he built from the people who had been quietly dismantling it while calling it help. I did not smile then because I was weak. I smiled because I had the evidence and the attorney, and the patience, and patience is the only revenge that leaves no damage to the person practicing it. People in my family had spent years describing me in a particular way. Quiet, they said, as though quiet meant empty. Distant, as though the space I kept meant I had nothing to protect it around. Difficult, the reliable adjective for any woman who declines to make her discomfort convenient for the people causing it. What they had not accounted for was what quiet people do with all that silence. They listen. They document. They keep the yellow legal pad, and they write the numbers down accurately, and they do not stop until the column totals match. My grandfather knew that about me. He put it in writing before he died. They should have read the documents more carefully. But then, that had always been the problem. They signed things without reading them, because consequences were something that happened to other people, and I was someone they had long ago filed under not a concern. I used to think that invisibility was a wound. It took me a long time to understand it was also a vantage point. From there, you can see everything. If there is something I carry out of all of this, it is not the legal victory, though the legal victory mattered. It is not the settlement, though the settlement was just. It is the memory of sitting across from Patricia in her walnut-smelling office the first time, sliding a folder of documents across her desk, and watching her read, watching her expression move from professional neutral to something that looked like recognition. She looked up after a few minutes and said, "You built this carefully." I said, "I learned from someone who believed careful was the only way worth doing anything." She nodded once, the way people nod when they have heard a lot of stories and can tell which ones are true. Then she opened her notepad, and we got to work. That is the part I think about when people ask me whether I regret how it went, whether there was a way to handle it that would have left fewer things broken. And I always think about the same answer, the one I have tested from different angles and keep arriving back at the same way you keep arriving at a correct total when the arithmetic is sound. I did not break anything that was not already broken. I stopped pretending the broken things were holding weight. There is a difference. It matters. My grandfather understood that too. He built his company to outlast the people who underestimated what he was making. He did not do it loudly. He did not do it to prove a point to anyone who had doubted him. He did it because the work was worth doing correctly, and because some things deserve to be built to last. I am 30 years old and I am the trustee of everything he left, and I intend to honor that the same way he would have, with attention, with documentation, with patience that does not look like patience until the moment it does. And if the people who once described me as the difficult one, the quiet one, the one who showed up only when convenient, if they have since revised that assessment, I do not need them to say so out loud. The corrected lease is on file. The accounts are reconciled. The name on the building has not changed. Some things do not need to be announced to be true.